Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Jim Naughton. Jim is an associate professor in the accounting area at the Darden School of Business, and his research examines how financial, legal, and regulatory institutions shape both financial disclosure and economic choices. We recently connected with Jim as part of our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours, and I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here's my interview with Jim Naughton. Jim, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So Jim, let's start with a pretty easy softball first question here. Tell us more about you. Who are you?
Who am I? Well, obviously an accounting professor now. Certainly not something I expected to be when I was younger. I kind of, meandered through life a little bit and sort of realized my interest as I grew up. I mean, one of the jokes, I'm originally from Ireland. So I've been in the US quite a while now. And when I first came to the US, I played basketball. That was my my interest like then. But academically, I always thought I wanted to do something in the sciences. I was good at math. And I thought at one point maybe to be an astronaut, realized I was too tall. You can't actually be my height and be an astronaut. So that sort of eliminated itself. But when I went through college, I ended up being an actuary who works at math all the time. And it was through that job I got exposed to a lot of accounting type issues. And it really just piqued my interest. I never sort of expected that to happen, but that's what happened. And that sort of led me to go to graduate school and sort of led me to where I am today.
So you mentioned you got exposed to accounting through your work. What was interesting to you about accounting?
Oh, sure. I think accounting is one of these things where at least my sort of bias when I was in my, my early to mid 20s, when I didn't know a lot about accounting was, it's just a bunch of rules. Here's a rule. If A, then B, you just kind of follow the rules. And, I was working in a consulting position where at the time, there was a lot of M&A activity where there was a drive to sort of increase manufacturing in the US. And so a lot of these older manufacturing companies were being acquired by larger publicly traded companies. And as part of that, me and my colleagues were hired to go in and evaluate all the things that were going on at these companies, both from an accounting standpoint and from a human capital standpoint. And what I realized through those assignments was just how much discretion there was in how things were managed from an accounting standpoint and how things were priced, how the private equity companies managed the portfolio companies, how they decided what was important to track, how they reported their performance. It turned out that there was a tremendous amount of, careful analysis where there really was a lot of decisions that could be made. And decisions that, right or wrong, they were, are you providing information that's more transparent, more useful? And it really just, as the more I did work in that area, the more interested I became. There was a few patterns, but there was a lot of things that seemed quite ad hoc. And it was just really fascinating to me. And so after, working in consulting for, it was about 9 years, that's when I started graduate school and made the decision to be an academic.
So for folks who spend a little time with your faculty profile page, they likely notice that you have a JD and a PhD. So what attracted you to a law degree?
So the way the way I think about my research and the way I think about the world is there's guidelines, right? So when you look at accounting, there's a lot of guidelines on how they want you to do things. And when you look at sort of how firms are regulated, there's also a lot of legal rules, often suggestions, often sort of, this is how things should run. And what I experienced when I was working is those rules often interacted with each other. And so what I was really interested in was not things that companies were doing sort of routinely at that time, but more, when you think about things like human capital, there's a lot of legal rules in terms of like how you manage your workforce, how you can provide pension obligations or, any of these sort of things. There's rules that are out there and there's sort of accounting guidelines for how you should report those items. But both were incomplete. And so what I was thinking of at the time was, I'd really like to be able to look at a company and understand its social impact. its contract with its workers. If I look at a company and I can look at earnings, I can look at sales, and those are pretty easy to measure. But ultimately, what I really care about is what's going to happen in the future. And through my work, I always felt that one of the biggest drivers of that was understanding how employees felt, how motivated they were, what the contract between them and the company looked like. And so what I was interested in was sort of thinking about how those things are managed. And, at the time, those are managed in part through legal requirements and in part through accounting, but obviously incomplete in both. And so that's sort of where I started, where I felt, okay, I really need a little bit of expertise in all these things if I want to go down this route.
So does that inform what you ultimately decide to look at as you do your PhD in your dissertation topic?
Yeah, I mean, things always vary. So I will say that academia is a mix of sort of what motivates us and then what we can realistically do. So a lot of times what you really want, there isn't necessarily the data to study that. And so what you do is you chip away over time. You sort of have the main motivation, which I still have, which is sort of understanding, the social performance of a company. That's still sort of my main motivation, but I chip away at it in different ways, depending on what kind of data I can get. And a lot of it falls into, so in accounting, we have different areas of research. And mine falls into what's called disclosure regulation. There's some mandatory disclosures, things you have to provide, and then there's a lot of things that are voluntary. And voluntary is sort of an interesting area in the sense that there are guidelines that turn what might be voluntary into mandatory because it's material. And there's guidelines that, if things are hard to measure, maybe you can't disclose them at all. And so there's a lot of sort of nuance in how that information gets communicated. And so a lot of what I do is still chipping away in that area. I've got a long way to go, long way to go still.
So as part of your journey to academia, obviously teaching is part of this too, in the classroom with students. What attracted you to teaching?
To teaching? Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think in my background, when you study engineering or math, a lot of the teaching is very unidirectional. You have a professor who kind of stands at the front of the room and gives you the information, and then you take down that information, and that sort of is how things sort of traditionally worked. And when I went to graduate school, I will sort of be the first to admit that my initial thoughts at that time were primarily along the research front. And I wasn't really, I knew I enjoyed presenting. When I worked in consulting, obviously I presented a lot to boards and to investor groups. And so I kind of, I knew I enjoyed that. I knew I understand the challenge of trying to explain complex transactions to interested parties. But what was really eye-opening to me when I was a graduate student, and just obviously in terms of, I did my doctoral degree at Harvard, where the emphasis is on case teaching. And so the end of my first year and then into my second year, I began sort of working closely with a faculty in the finance department, teaching review sessions and teaching, finance material using the case method. And it was something that I just fell in love with. It was just so exhilarating to sort of not be the one providing the information, but to actually just be sitting back and listening to the students and just sort of guiding the students in their conversations with each other. And that to me was something that really, lit a passion for me for being in the classroom. And ultimately, obviously I was at Kellogg for about 7 years there, before I came to Darden. But one of the big drivers to come to Darden is the emphasis on case teaching. Once you commit to case teaching, it really is the best way to manage a classroom, and it's by far the most efficient way of learning material and really internalizing it. And so that's something that I sort of didn't expect, quite honestly, when I started my graduate school. But once I experienced it, it was clear to me at that point that this is really what I wanted to be from a teaching standpoint.
I want to unpack something that you just shared there. So, best way to manage the classroom, most efficient way to learn material, case method. Why do you feel that way?
Oh, so one of the things that and if we go by this again as a graduate student, when I would talk to students about sort of what they learned in class, um, years later. So like I would, I mean, I was doing some of this, sort of the end of my first year into my second year. And then even a couple of years later, I remember bumping into a group of students at a road race in Boston. And they were like, oh, we loved you for finance, whatever. And they would say, I still remember, and they would still remember the takeaway in very sort of clear ways. And the reason, I think a lot of us have sort of different intuition for why that happens. Mine has always been that if I tell you the answer, you're sort of like, oh yeah, I knew that. That was the answer. I kind of knew that. But with the case method, we don't tell you the answer, or sometimes there isn't even really an answer. But what you do in the classroom is you try to figure out what the answer is. And so students are going back and forth trying to figure out how something should work. And in accounting, that's especially interesting because you have your intuition, so your economic intuition for how things should work, but then you have this overlay of what the regulators want. And so you have sort of these layered ways of sort of figuring out how it should work from, an economic intuition standpoint, but then also how it should work from a regulatory standpoint and why. And once you go through all of those thoughts and trying to figure it out, you just remember it. And when you're faced with similar, because in accounting, there's a lot of things that work very similarly. And I think that once you sort of get comfortable with the process of figuring out how things should work, that's really the learning. So, if I told you the rule for something, it would be, I think just far less effective in the long run. So you may remember it that week, you may remember for a test 3 weeks later, but when you get out of the MBA program and 3 years later you're in a boardroom and something comes up, you won't have that as background. But my experience with, my early experience, basically, suggest that's how you remember things. It's the figuring it out. And I will say, as a parent, that's why I torture my kids. I make them figure everything out. So it works in every way, in my opinion. That's just good way of doing things.
You teach accounting in the core curriculum, and the course is called Accounting for Managers. And I will say, talking with prospective students, if there's a course or two that they're nervous about coming into business school, I think accounting would be one of those courses. How would you describe the accounting course that students encounter here at Darden?
Yeah, so the accounting here is very different from what you would do at sort of what we'll call for students that have sort of taken an introductory accounting class online or in an undergraduate environment. Those are very what we call rules-based lectures. They just tell you, oh, if it's this transaction, this is how you record it. And that is not the intent of what we do at Darden. So what we do at Darden is we're trying to teach you how to make decisions and to use accounting information to help you support your decision or to help guide your decision. And so that's very different. So, if you go back to what I used to work on in M&A, one of the things that often happens in those types of transactions is you acquire assets. Some of them you can value, some of them you can't. Sometimes these transactions work, sometimes they don't. And sort of years later, sometimes you have to update your accounting because something you acquired just didn't turn out to be that valuable. And sort of how do you decide when to do that? So it turns out there's a lot of leeway in when you do that. And then how much should you do? Should you do all of it up front? Should you do it over time? What are your choices as a manager? And a lot of what we look at is sort of thinking through those problems. And one of the cases we use, we happen to have, a change in the CEO. And what you see is the fact that you have a new CEO really changes the accounting. And again, if you go back to me, more than 20 years ago when I was a young guy, not really thinking about accounting, I would not have expected that, oh, just because you have a different CEO, you get different accounting results. But it turns out there's a lot of incentives at play and there's a lot of discretion in the system. And so helping, in very simple terms, nobody's doing anything right or wrong. It's just, my strategy is A, the old CEO strategy was B. And I'm just building my accounting system to support A, or I had previously built it to support B. And so you just sort of see these things kind of work their way through. And so really the value of what we're trying to provide is, for people that are going to be managing entities, it's really the way they think about accounting. So accounting is unavoidable. There's, you can, as a young undergraduate student going out for your first job for the first couple of years, you can avoid knowing accounting. But there's nobody who's risen to a director or VP level that sort of doesn't have to deal with accounting in their everyday work. But the way in which they deal with it is not, this is how you enter transactions or this is how you make a cash flow statement. It's, well, what are the incentives and what are my choices? And how do I think about what it is that I want to communicate to investors? And that's really the perspective that we take in the class. So what I find, if we look at the couple of years that, the last couple of years of teaching here, I would say the number one feedback that I get is this class was so much better than I thought it was going to be. So exactly on lines with, you come in thinking, oh my God, accounting, it's going to be torture. But it turns out to be a little mix of strategy and leadership, and it's really about decision making. And that just, honestly, that's what you need as an MBA student. You're not going to work in these entry level roles for long, and what you really need is the decision making.
One of the things that you mentioned is sort of having students sort of think about their intuition and then also think about sort of the accounting rules. I've always been struck, having sat through an occasional accounting course, by how much discussion there is around sort of intuition. Like how do you think this should go, or what's your feeling here? That was surprising to me, at least having taken a college accounting class.
Yeah, and honestly, that's why we teach in that way, because that's how you remember. Because a lot of times, if you see how your intuition is slightly different from what the regulator will allow, that's something that you can internalize much easier. And so the discussion is almost always set up in that way, where we're trying to make a decision and we're just listing off the constraints. So what can we do reasonably from a regulatory standpoint, and what do we really want to do if we weren't constrained, and how do we reconcile those two? And just thinking through things that way.
Do you have a favorite case you go through in the accounting for managers class? Is there one that stands out? You mentioned the CEO change case, but is there another one that you'd want to share?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the nice cases we do early on when we're looking at revenue recognition, which is it's one of the earliest topics we basically cover it right away, sort of in the first few weeks. Revenue recognition is one of the many rules where you think, oh, it's if A, then B. I just have to follow the rule. But the way it's written is actually, it's not black and white. And so one of the things we talk about is, a transaction has to have commercial substance. And what exactly does that mean? And that means different things to different people in the class. And one of the things that's really beautiful in the classroom is lots of the students have experiences. Oh, I worked in this industry and we had this transaction and we recorded it. And they talk about sort of the commercial substance of the transaction. And it's amazing the variation that you get in the room. And so to me, that class is one of the things that's so great about it is it brings in people from all backgrounds. So as an example, sort of I had this just a couple of weeks ago when we were teaching this class, someone who was in a sales and marketing background had proposed a sales incentive program. And and they tested with customers. Customers loved it. They thought it was going to be a huge success. But when it went through sort of evaluation internally, the accountants were pushing back. And it was just one of those things that if you actually follow this incentive program, it would create all kinds of problems on the accounting side. And it was in many ways, I don't want to divulge what this student was working on, but it was very similar to what Tesla had done several years ago, where when they initially started selling their cars, they put in what's called a buyback guarantee. So after 3 years, we'll buy back your car at a predetermined price. And it turns out, if you do that, you can't recognize revenue until the end of the 3-year period. So even if you sell all the cars in the world today when it feel like sales, they're not actually sales until you've got to the end of that 3-year period, and there's a decision being made on the buyback or not. And so understanding, sort of how to tweak that, so instead of it being a buyback, you have something that's similar but not sort of over the regulatory line, was really, eye-opening for that student and for others in the room.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Jim. I want to talk about an elective that you teach, sustainability measurement and disclosure. What was the inspiration for this class?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, honestly, accounting is moving away from revenue and earnings in very simple terms. If you go back 20 years, every company had sort of a big focus just on providing the accounting numbers. And that's something that I experienced when I was working and thought was a big shortcoming. And I obviously wasn't alone. So today, most companies produce annual reports that have information about their sustainability practices, their employee practices, their engagement with the community. There's all kinds of things in there. And on top of that, most companies will also have separate sustainability reports that talk about their performance on environmental and social dimensions and governance as well. And so that's really been something that's changed enormously in the last 15 years. And I still, the first paper that I ever published, which was published in, a very good journal in accounting, was on, what we at that time was called CSR reporting, but is now called ESG reporting. And I remember at the time, my colleagues, there was a very mixed view on that paper. Some felt, ESG, that's not even a real area of accounting. And some felt, oh, well, that's the future of accounting. So you had sort of two very sort of strong opposite views. And that was less than 10 years ago. And I think in the last, particularly in the last 5 years, the market has really sort of recognized how important that is. Employees that work at companies these days, they care. They don't just look at earnings and say, hey, earnings were good. I'm really happy I'm working here. I mean, it's nice, but they really care about the environmental footprint of the company that they work for. They really care about how employees are treated. There's so many other things that matter, and investors feel the same way. And so, so a couple years ago, when I proposed this, there was a little bit of pushback, and but I was able to convince the people here that no, this is the future of how we're going to be thinking about accounting, and they supported it in the end, actually very strongly. To be fair, so normally courses are only approved for sort of short periods and things like that. Mine was given sort of blanket approval for an extended period. We'll say. In the after a little convincing, so I've been very lucky, and it's every year my enrollment goes up. We have a pretty full class this past year, and one of the things that we're starting to see is when you think about sort of traditional accounting, it was really managed by accountants, right? So when you had your revenue and your earnings, that was always audited by CPAs. That's just sort of traditionally how it worked. With the ESG side, there's still accountants are involved, but a lot of it has really been managed by business school graduates because they just have a better understanding of the strategy of a company and sort of, you have to be thinking about environmental regulations. It's not just accounting rules. And so there's a lot of things that sort of mix in there. And one of the things that I found out sort of earlier this year from one of my students is, the hiring of individuals to sort of help with these ESG reports. So, the audit, the management, the consulting, all the things that sort of the traditional Big Four accounting firms provide, those firms have been hiring more people to handle ESG reporting than traditional financial accounting reporting. And so really that's where things are going. So if you look at any conference call when a company announces earnings, these days about a third of the questions are on your social performance, these other dimensions. And these things matter, obviously, you know, in terms of how you think about the company that you're working for, but they also have implications on the financial side. I mean, if we just take carbon, which is probably the most commonly disclosed item, it's the one where we do have some rules, not so much in the US, but certainly outside the US, that are going to be required for big companies pretty soon. It really is something where companies recognize that reducing their carbon output or carbon footprint is a big issue, and I think they recognize that at some point, if they don't act, if they don't show progress, they're going to be regulated. And so a lot of these disclosures are being designed to sort of get ahead of that regulation. And it's really something that's just fascinating to watch at this time.
I'm curious, is there, it's always nice to hear about a story or a case from a class. Is there a case that you read in that class that you think would be sort of fairly reflective of what you do?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so we do have, so I have one case. I mean, obviously for my elective, I get to write the cases. I've written the cases I described for the accounting firm I also wrote. So obviously there's a bias here. We always like our own stuff. So again, I like my own stuff for the elective as well. And the one case I really, where the class really gets engaged is on, so the term you hear is greenwashing. And so it's with, so the company that's where the decision is being made is Zara, which is a fast fashion retailer. It's an industry that has endemic problems, right? Just simply because you're a fast fashion company, it's hard not to have a pretty significant environmental footprint. So just textiles in general have pretty heavy footprint. And so what we do in that case, though, is we're in the position of a senior executive at Zara who's trying to deal with some accusations of greenwashing. And he's just trying to figure out, how do I respond to this? So what are the things we should do to sort of manage the perception that we're not greenwashing, or that these accusations are somewhat unfair? And so what the case guides you through is sort of, there's actually many kinds of greenwashing. So one of the, most companies don't sort of overtly lie about environmental activities. I mean, there are cases where that happens, but that tends not to be the norm. It's more that, I do 6 different things, 2 of which are bad for the environment, and all I talk about are the 4 that aren't. Or I'll talk about the one that's the best, right? And so there's a little bit of what we call greenwashing by omission. And then there's some where it's, what we call greenwashing by influence, where, you'll produce reports that have nice glossy pictures showing you doing really nice environmental things, but it's not clear that you even do those things. And so what we guide you through in the case is sort of how to think about greenwashing from the different stakeholders, at least in the US. So one of the things that's, I think, interesting that the students sort of unpack as we go through the case is the way in which investors are protected in a way that's very different from customers. So, if I'm selling clothes like Zara does in a store, and I put a tag on the clothes that says made from 100% recycled material, and it turns out that's just the tag, not the clothes, is that something consumers can sue for? And it turns out it is. And there's, the entity in the US is called the Federal Trade Commission, and it talks about sort of why they would be involved with something like that versus other things. Whereas when it comes to investors, it's much different. And so if we're trying to deal with an investor perception, the things that we need to do are very different. And so it's more of a materiality threshold where, the average investor could reasonably assume that it has a meaningful impact on reported financial results. It doesn't have to be in the current period, it can be in the future, but it's a much more nebulous statement. And so working through sort of that and thinking about, well, these are the things we've been saying. Is this a problem from a consumer standpoint, or is this a problem from an investor standpoint? Is this a problem from an employee standpoint? How do we think about these things? And then obviously in the cases there's also a regulatory standpoint where, at least in Europe, there's a push to sort of add additional regulations given the waste in that industry. And so, you're thinking about all these different parties and how they think about what you're doing and trying to sort of, communicate in a way that you sort of accept that, listen, we know there's waste in our system, we can't avoid it, but here are all the things we do to try to manage it, to minimize its impact, and really sort of developing that approach. And that's really what's interesting. And the students sort of have a wonderful background and really have a very good discussion about all those different topics. And it really, and I'll, for those of you, listening, I didn't mention the word accounting entry or debit or credit at all. And that's, again, typical of how we think about accounting at Darden. You're in a position where you're trying to communicate with investors and you're thinking really about the big picture.
So I wanted to stay with this topic of ESG disclosure a little bit more, because I know this is obviously something that's a big interest of yours. And is there like a collective understanding of what constitutes ESG and disclosing these things? It sounds like it's still very much evolving, and maybe some leeway that companies may have since there's not this collective, oh, this is exactly what this means kind of decision.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's honestly, that's what makes it so interesting. So when you look at the evolution of accounting, it kind of goes through stages, right? So if we go back to the 1920s in the US, the regulations for what you told as earnings and revenue were pretty limited. And there was a lot of instances of companies just not being entirely honest, and led to problems, and they sort of corrected it over time with many, many, many rules. When you look at the environmental side, there's I think it would be fair to say that we all recognize its importance. But the thing that there's several things that make it interesting. One of them is it's very hard to look at companies across industries and sort of understand what it is that they can control versus they can't control. And so that's really where the disclosures are right now. Is it's really companies trying to explain, well, this is our footprint, at least from a carbon standpoint. And these are the parts we think we can control. These are the parts we can't. These are the parts. And when I say can't, if you look at, a car manufacturer that produces combustion engine cars, at the end of the day, those cars, when used by customers, are going to generate emissions. It's really, there's no way around that. And even if you produce, electric engine cars, how those get charged has emissions implications, right? So if I charge it at home and I'm on a grid that sources the electricity from a coal plant, those are emissions. And sort of understanding all those things and what you can and can't control is really where the disclosures are right now. We're really trying to get our hands around sort of the parts where companies can make decisions. And that to me is really interesting, because when you think about ultimately where we want to be, there's this idea that, if we provide money for projects, companies will do the right projects. But, if you ask, I think people that have been looking at this for a little bit longer, what they'll say is what really matters is that we have the information. If we know exactly what companies are doing and we know what they have control over and what they don't have control over, then we can, once we have all the information, then we can decide where we need to intervene and provide financial incentives in order to get them to do the things we want them to do. And so a lot of what's happening on the accounting side is really sort of the first step in really getting to a place where companies are doing what we want them to ultimately do. And as you mentioned, is that uniform in terms of what where we're thinking things would be? It's at the moment absolutely not. So it's somewhat uniform, at least for carbon, but for most other items, it is not. So, companies have other chemicals that they release into the environment. There's the forever chemicals that are, associated with nonstick and cookware and other things where, those are regulated by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S., and there are requirements to figure out how much of that is happening in your operations. But there's no, you'd be hard pressed to find financial statement disclosures that talk about, the forever chemical discharges from sort of a measurement standpoint. So there are things that deal with the litigation related to it. That's a whole different accounting thing, but just how you're managing it from a non-litigation standpoint, just from an environmental standpoint, you tend not to see too many disclosures. And that's not because it's not important. It obviously is. It's more the evolution of accounting. So 5 years from now, will you see it? Yeah, you will. It's just a matter of companies coming to an agreement on how they should disclose things. The regulator sort of viewing what they're doing as acceptable and not feeling the need to step in, and then just seeing it sort of happen. And then once it becomes somewhat uniform, now we could get the auditors and the rating agencies involved, and they can look at companies and say, yeah, I can evaluate what you're doing on this particular dimension because now it's uniform. And so all of that is sort of happening right now. And I think part of the reason why, the students in my class are so interested in it is they know once they get out there and they're working, this is going to be part of how they do their job. So if you're working on a project and it's, a wind farm or whatever it is, that part of it is going to be thinking about, well, what do we want to communicate about the performance? How do we think about measuring success? Because it's not just dollars and cents anymore. There's other things that go into it. And so just opening up that perspective is really what's there in the class. But to your original question, there's a lot of discretion. And obviously that means some companies are taking advantage, some are not, and there's a mix. And sort of, we talk a lot about how do we distinguish between them.
I know one of the things you've spent some time researching is how retail investors think about ESG disclosures versus more traditional financial disclosures. So what have you learned through that research?
Yeah. So that was a very interesting project. So when the SEC started to think about regulating ESG, which is really, quite frankly, only a couple of years ago, one of the things that came up in their deliberations is, well, as a regulator, we're not trying to protect these large hedge funds. Well, we're trying to protect our mom and pop investors. And so anything that we do as a regulator, the idea is that we're making those mom and pop investors better off. The big guys, they can always figure things out, but we really need to think about mom and pop. And so I was very fortunate at that time. Robinhood, at that time, was still providing their trading data for their individual investors. And so we were able to get trading data for a pretty large group of individual retail investors. And we're able to use that data to look at how they respond to different types of accounting communications and financial communications. And so, there's things about, CEO turnover, appointing a new board seat, earnings related, revenue, all these sorts of things. And then the ESG disclosures as well across different dimensions. And what we found using, primarily using the Robinhood data, but also using some other data where you're able to sort of infer retail investors based on the trade type and things like that. We found that retail investors sort of just weren't responding the day of or the 2 or 3 days surrounding ESG disclosures. And that was true even if it was material. So even if there was a change in the stock price at the market level, so the stock price that day changed because of a very material ESG disclosure. And one of the examples of that is, when a company is named one of the best 100 companies to work for, that's a pretty strong signal that they're doing a lot of things right by their employees. And typically when companies are added to that list for the first time, you see this positive response. And so but we didn't find it for the retail investors. So we found it for the market. We found it for non-retail investors, but we didn't find it on the retail side. And so one of the things I think that's interesting about that paper is there's multiple ways to sort of interpret our results. So the way we interpreted it was that the disclosures, in part because they're voluntary in nature, they're also voluntary in structure. And so they don't always give you a clean way to understand the implications of what's being disclosed. And so it's just very, very hard for retail investors to sort of process these disclosures. And so in very simple terms, if I gave you just random information, you would say, well, they don't respond, it's just random. But if I give you value relevant information, but I give it to you in a way that's impossible to process, it looks as if it's random, but it's not. And so one of the things that was really nice in our study is we're able to distinguish between those two, because we're able to show that the market is responding and retail investors are not, which tells you that it's really that, this information is helpful, it's useful, it's financially material. It's just not something that retail investors can currently process. And that's really sort of is the key distinction in our study. If you see it cited, it's not always going to be cited for that. Some people will cite our paper and say, oh, you see, retail investors don't want these disclosures, which is absolutely not what our tests show. If you read past the first few pages, it's pretty clear what we're trying to do, which is be a little more subtle and really kind of figure out why it is that they're not responding. And so for us, it's really, the disclosure landscape right now is just too fragmented, and it's too unstructured, and that's really to the disadvantage of retail investors. And so for us, the takeaway is, we need to get some type of mandatory disclosure in there, at least in format, even if it's just for some items, like obviously carbon is one where that's possible to do. And I think that if we do that, then we'll start to see what we want to see, which is, we're giving retail investors information they can actually act on, and then hopefully they will. And so that paper was, we always say there's multiple audiences for papers. This one was obviously just published this year. It was very popular with regulators. So because it was really the first time that there was clear empirical evidence that the current regime is not meeting the needs of retail investors. And so that was really something that was very, very helpful for them.
Well, somewhat related to that, the question that we've gotten in the Q&A, obviously this is voluntary disclosure at this point with ESG. How do companies think about, is this worth it, the cost of not disclosing this? Obviously, there seems to be this bifurcation in terms of how some of these investors may think about this information, but obviously it's something that companies must be weighing out too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not surprisingly, it depends where you're located and who you're responding to. I mean, so there are some companies, the practice, the colloquial term is called green hushing, where you do things that are good, but you don't talk about it. And then there's greenwashing, which is quite literally the opposite, where you say you do good things, but you don't. And so, and you see this spectrum across companies in terms of their actions, and you see the same thing on the disclosure the landscape as well. So how do you figure it out? That's facts and circumstances. So we have, in my class, we have a couple of cases where you're trying to figure out, is this a useful disclosure or is this just hyperbole? Is this just sort of almost like marketing, where it's just giving some sound bites, but it's not really backed by real action? And we have ways at the sort of as researchers where we can distinguish some of those things. So there's early work on this. I have some, we'll call it, it's certainly unpublished, but just some empirical work where we've looked at different ways of categorizing disclosures. And a lot of it has to do with, natural language processing, the use of numbers, the use of tables. There's a lot of sort of subtle things that we can measure across disclosures. And so, we don't obviously have a published study or peer-reviewed study on this yet, but one of the things that at least we see in the data is it does matter. The things that you would expect to see, some more direct language, more use of numbers, it ends up in a disclosure that's much more meaningful than if it's not. And one of the other things that we've looked at is sort of when you bundle disclosures. So, when really good financial news is accompanied with really good environmental news, like, is that different than if it's bad financial news but similarly good environmental news? And just looking at how investors process the information. So that still is a very much an ongoing area of research, where I think, hopefully the next 5 or 10 years we'll have some good insights as to which direction. But there's a lot of very smart people working on that right now. So we'll get there. But in the class, we talk about these things and we look at specific examples, and it's very tricky at the moment.
Another thing that you've been researching is how companies get involved with political contributions and what this may mean for their regulatory outcomes. That feels like a very hot topic, type of issue. So, what got you interested in this, and what have you learned through it?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a yeah. Sometimes you don't want to be too sensational, but at the same time, sometimes you can't help yourself. You want to look at the most interesting things. So one of the things I got to experience a few years ago was testifying as an expert in front of Congress on some proposed legislation to deal with a pension issue, and just thinking about sort of the different stakeholders that are involved and how they think about things, and just coming out of that experience, one of the things that I had not fully appreciated was sort of how connected our elected officials are with our regulatory bodies, and they, for many things, they actually have to work together to figure out what to do, right? So if you're going to pass new laws on, for example, insider trading by elected officials, you need to talk to the people at the SEC, at the accounting standards centers, to understand what they're seeing in their data, how they work together. So there's lots of good reasons why they need to communicate and why they need to be in touch. And so one of the things that my colleagues and I started thinking about was, well, what if there's also some things that aren't as good? And so we ended up sort of walking down this path of thinking about, well, connections are important, connections are good, and they do in fact do a lot of good. But what if they also give an unfair advantage to some companies over another, right? So if I happen to be a company that's actively involved politically, and I have sort of an ongoing relationship with people at the regulatory agency, does that mean that, if I have an accounting issue, do I get differential treatment? And it's not, so the idea of that is not that, they give you favoritism or they cut you a break. That's certainly not the idea. The idea is more that you have better information, right? So as a company, you have access to regulators, which gives you better information to understand what it is that they care about. They give you better information about sort of how to address potential issues in your internal controls or in how you're doing your accounting. And so what we do in that study is we basically think about ways that the companies can be connected to the regulator, and we look specifically at meetings between the company and the SEC, and we look at sort of how that affects the regulatory process. And consistent with what I've been suggesting, it turns out that if you're connected, you're able to get better outcomes. And again, it's not nefarious in any way. It's just sort of endemic in the system where the way when I talk to my my friends and family about it, it's college admissions. If your best friend is the head of college admissions at a school and he's able to tell you how admissions work, it just gives you better information about how to handle the process. And there's nothing wrong with him telling you how it works. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's perhaps a good thing. But it just, when it's uneven, where he only talks to you and doesn't talk to other people, it just creates a little bit of unevenness in the process. And that's really what we were trying to document in that study is that happens. And just from a big picture standpoint, you know, unevenness happens in many aspects of our lives, and it's something that is just quite honestly a fact of life. But at the same time, it's not ideal when it affects regulation. Because the idea there is everybody really should be subject to the same rules and the same outcomes. And so it's just sort of highlighting that, maybe we need to manage these things a little bit more carefully, just so everybody gets the same information.
Well, you mentioned your testimony on Capitol Hill related to pensions. I do want to give a few minutes here to talk about your interest in pensions. What got you interested in this particular topic?
So honestly, pensions is one of those areas where the accounting choices are many, and so what you see is something that there's just a lot of variation in what not only companies but states do. And one of the recent papers that I've worked on, it was also published this past year, was looking at state pension rules. So I have a longstanding interest in pensions. To me, it's one of the key ways in which employees sort of become attached to a employer. So it's not just, hey, we give you a wage, call it a day. It's we're going to give you these post-retirement, we're going to give you a pension, we're going to give you medical. It's much more of a relationship than just show up to work today and we'll pay you. So I've always been interested in how companies use pensions to sort of build an employee relationship. And one of the things that's I think interesting in the pension front is companies are very there's a lot of variation in what companies know, or states know about what they're doing with their pension plans, how well they're funded, and sort of one of the things that I've studied, and then I'll talk a little bit about something else that I'm currently getting data on, was just thinking about, well, why is it that they're managed in the way they're managed? And so one of the things that we were able to do was look at the county level in the U.S. There was this change where all of a sudden they had to account for their pension plans. They didn't. Some did before, some didn't. So excuse me. Some did and some didn't, and then all of a sudden everybody had to. And so it was sort of bringing everyone to a common basis. And it was really just documenting, does that change the employee contract? So do these counties that all of a sudden have to start providing information change how they manage the plan? And it turns out that they do. And what we find in that study, a lot of it has to do with the understanding of how the costs kind of flow over time. So if all I had to report was what I put into the plan this year, I manage it very differently than if I know what the total obligations will be in the future. And so there's just some very interesting things there about sort of how that was being managed. And sort of closely related to that, one of the things that we're still working on getting data from and just thinking about is, many states in the US, when you start today, will give you a choice between a savings plan and a pension plan. So either you get some percent of pay put in a savings account and you sort of manage it yourself, or we'll give you a pension. So Virginia's one of them. So I went through this choice when I started. I'm sure you did too. But the other states have as well. And so the state that we're trying to get data on is actually Texas, where they provide a similar offer. And the idea there is we're just trying to figure out how employees make this choice. So there's a lot of concern in the US about sort of these unfunded pension plans and how much money it is. And a lot of the variation in how critical you think the problem is how much you think those pension obligations are worth, right? So the states will tell you, oh, it's like $1.5 trillion. Some economists will tell you it's $6 trillion because they just sort of value them in a different way. And so what we're trying to get at is, well, how do the employees value them? So do the employees value them at 1.5? Do the employees value them at 2? Do they employ them at 7? Like, what's the number? And our suspicion is that the employee number is a lot lower than so what some economists are doing. So we're trying to work our way from that perspective to sort of think about, what is the scale of the problem here? And just think about it from that perspective.
That's super interesting. I feel like pension conversation also bubbled up around 2007, 2008 here in the United States as risky investments lost a lot of value. Who backstops those pensions? You also saw some
That's
of the
right.
bankruptcies with large companies, people who had pensions slashed because of those bankruptcies. I mean, there's a lot that's there.
Yeah, that's right. And the legislation that I was testifying at in Capitol Hill was a situation where it ultimately there was a bailout of about 120 billion that the government provided to a certain group of pension plans for, what, depending on your perspective, was bad luck or mismanagement. And so there was, there's tremendous economic concerns about that system. And so, as an accountant, I'm thinking, well, what are the numbers? If we have good numbers, we can make better decisions. So that's where I am, and that's where I'm thinking.
All right, Jim, last question for you here. So a piece of advice for our prospective students on the call today, something for them to think about as they go forth on their own MBA journeys.
Sure. Yeah. So the an MBA is really an opportunity to put yourself on a different trajectory. And what you want to be thinking about with an MBA degree is not, well, what's this going to do to my earnings 3 years from now? Or what's this going to do to, my immediate job prospects? Because that's not really what you want to be thinking about. You really want to be thinking long term. And so what I'd encourage you all to do is think, okay, where do I want to be 10 years from now? What is the type of job that I want to have 10 years from now? And then think about the type of MBA degree that will get you to perform best in that job. And that's really, it's not easy, but that's really the thought process you want to go to. There's very often when I talk to students, there's this bias to think about the short term because it's easy. But that's really what you want to avoid here. As much as possible, you want to think about where do I want to be in 10 years? And then really build what you do academically around that.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time and for answering all of my questions. And I hope you have a happy holiday season and to all of our attendees, happy holidays and have a great rest of the week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, everyone.
And that was my interview with Jim Naughton, an associate professor in the accounting area at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, SDARDEN, @virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.